coup began in large measure. There was always wanting an effort to overturn the president, but the coup began with the appointment of the Mueller special counsel operation. You had a discussion between Rod Rosenstein, Andrew McCabe, the then acting FBI director fired for misconduct since then, about wearing a wire on the president and invoking the 25th Amendment illicitly to overthrow him. Also part of that discussion was the corrupt appointment of Robert Mueller, who had interviewed for the FBI position, I think, the day before he was appointed. So he was inherently conflicted from investigating the very issue he was hired to do, because he had sought the job of FBI director, and he was being asked to investigate how that job opening occurred. It's just incredible violations of any sense of fairness and any rule related to the conflict of interests that supposedly govern Justice Department actions. But when it comes to getting President Trump, all bets are off. So you had this then aggressive effort by the Mueller special counsel operation to harass the president. And it was all based on, in large measure, this fraudulent dossier created by the Democratic National Committee and Hillary Clinton's campaign, secretly, of course. And the dossier was known to be basically, it was known that the dossier had no credibility. Robert Mueller, in January of 2017, admitted that it was minimally corroborated when he showed it to the president in an attempt to, in my view, intimidate him and trying to keep his job the same way J. Edgar Hoover allegedly did with various presidents. So then that didn't stop the deep state and Mr. Mueller from continuing to pursue this fraudulent piece of information to harass the president. And in large measure, it was in the last year, the beginning of last year, where they indicted some Russians related to the hacking or Russia involvement in setting up fake Facebook accounts where they spent $100,000 or so to try to influence the election. So there were some indictments there, but of course there were Russians, and the indictments never went out of their way, and in terms of the public comments about that by the Justice Department, they went out of their way to say there were no Americans knowingly involved in this. So they knew a year ago there was no collusion. So despite that, they continued to harass the president, and we now finally have the Mueller report. Of course, they kept that conclusion, I guarantee you they made, away from the American people through an election cycle. So there's potential corruption there. And now they created this gargantuan report, nearly 400 pages, where they admit there was no evidence of Russia collusion with President Trump. No evidence. That means the dossier was a fraud and a fake. And on top of that, they came up with this smear job part of the report based on Barr's analysis or Attorney General Barr's description of it, saying that there was no obstruction of justice, or they didn't have any evidence to get them to file an obstruction of justice charge, although they said that he wasn't exonerated of obstruction of justice. Barr rightly saw through that garbage and said, no, there is no obstruction of justice, and we're not filing any charges, and we're not concluding there would be obstruction of justice here. So the deep state has been unhappy with the way Barr has described the Mueller report. Now, you may recall, if you watch us here repeatedly, that I have always opposed the very idea of a Mueller report. The notion that the Justice Department could write a report, especially on the president's decision-making, as to whether to hire or fire or whatever, any personnel, like the FBI director, James Comey, is just completely absurd. So the Justice Department now has the ability to comment on the president's hiring and firing practices and gets to decide whether or not it's obstruction of justice? That's ridiculous. And is it going to be applied to the Justice Department internally as well? If a prosecutor declines to file a charge or files charges and leaves others on the table, Are we going to now investigate them for obstruction of justice? It doesn't make any sense. And it makes less sense, obviously, for the president, who's elected by the people of the United States to run the executive branch, to abuse the Justice Department to investigate him for firing the FBI director. So what happened this week is that the Mueller operation began leaking to the Washington Post and to the state and to the New York Times that there was more to the Mueller report than Mr. Barr had summarized, and it may make the president look bad. Well, that's no surprise. I've been warning you of that since the get-go. Now, just because there's another dossier out there, that doesn't necessarily mean that someone like Attorney General Barr wouldn't see through, as I say, the smears and come to the conclusion, as evidently even Mr. Mueller did, there was no Russia collusion and there was nothing credible to suggest an obstruction of justice charge. So, but it shows you the coup effort against President Trump continues. And sure enough, now what goes on when you have documents like this that potentially can be publicly released, there's a process that the government goes through. It's always too slow. I don't need any lectures from anyone here in Washington, D.C., or anyone in the media about what transparency is. I've been here at Judicial Watch for 20 years. We've been doing this work for 25 years. Judicial Watch knows what transparency is. We know what the law requires. We've fought virtually every issue that's under debate right now for grand jury material, executive privilege material, internal Justice Department documents, FBI documents, you name it. Judicial Watch has litigated it. So, but we do know how the process works. And the Justice Department evidently received 400 pages of material, every page of which was marked as containing potentially grand jury material. So what that means is that grand jury material cannot be released on its own by the Justice Department, meaning the Justice Department just can't decide unilaterally to release grand jury material. They need the permission of the courts. And the courts don't like to release grand jury material. Sometimes they authorize the release of grand jury material in historical cases where witnesses have passed away or the targets of the investigation have passed away. I think there was some a court ruling recently in that regard in one of the Nixon cases. But typically grand jury material never sees the light of day. And then of course there's executive privilege material. Remember, the Justice Department received 1 million plus pages of documents from the White House. The White House never waived executive privilege in sending that material over there. So the president has prerogatives that the courts recognize and that everyone else in Washington recognizes for any other president, but evidently not for President Trump. Now, the president is weighed in generally saying he wants the information to be released. Attorney General Barr said they're going to try to release as much as they can. In Judicial Watch litigation, of course, Judicial Watch, again, finding out information before anyone else as a result of our FOIA litigation, because we have been asking for certain documents that were covered by the Mueller operation that may now be released as a result of the report being issued. And the Justice Department got back to us and they said they got to evaluate the Mueller report and they'll figure out what to do by April 16th. Which you can read to mean that they'll have finished analyzing the Mueller report by the middle of the month. What's today, the 5th? So about a week and a half from now. Now that's not satisfactory to the Democrats. And Jerry Nadler, who's the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee for the Democrats on the Hill, abused his power to issue a subpoena for the Mueller report. Now, a subpoena is not a magic wand, which, you know, in many ways it kind of is he's not only trying to fool the media, but he's trying to fool his supporters by pretending that magically the Mueller report, at least those portions that would not be released, will automatically be released because there's a subpoena. As I said, these privileges can't be, executive privilege can be waived, so maybe the administration can decide not to do the fight and that the privilege doesn't need to be upheld here or vindicated here, and they just release it in the public interest. Or they may not decide not to, and there's no good reason to suggest that the court will necessarily say that it's inappropriate to assert an executive privilege. And on grand jury material, a subpoena is not a good enough reason and will not allow the Justice Department to release a grand jury material. As I said, when they filed the 81 subpoenas or 81 document requests about a month or so ago to everyone in the Trump world, individual recipients of those letters can say no. And like with the Mueller report, they can issue a subpoena if they need it. The Democrats, part of their harassment campaign against the president. And those subpoenas are, as I say, not magic. They're not self-enforcing. The House has to go to court to enforce the subpoena. So this is a battle, assuming the Justice Department wants to fight it, that could take months, if not years, to resolve. In fact, we're asking for the Mueller report. That's what we do. We're a transparency organization. We're asking for the investigative file. We've got a broad request in. My guess is we'll probably get documents under the FOIA process, as we have in the past, sooner than Congress will. But let me just say this. There should never have been a Mueller report. I guarantee you Mueller and his team of anti-Trump activists wrote a report as another way to try to get the president removed. Hence the abuse of power in creating this obstruction of justice canard that they tried to put into the lap of AG Barr. Justice Department had no business creating or disseminating a report on the president's decision to fire James Comey or take other official acts as president. Because it's pretty clear they're criticizing the president and suggesting that his criticism of Mueller might be obstruction of justice. His firing of Comey might be obstruction of justice. All public acts by a president. To cover up what, you might ask, especially since Mueller had concluded there was no underlying crime or scandal of collusion. So, in many ways, the horse is out of the barn because the report's been created. There'll be political pressure to release it. But I think the report should never have been created. The Justice Department made a mistake in allowing Mueller to keep on keeping on against the president. The report should have been just a few words. We apologize, Mr. President. There's nothing there. And we're sorry that we abused our powers to try to remove you from office. And we apologize to the taxpayers for spending, $30 million, even though we knew there was nothing to be found. So the Democrats are desperate to change the conversation because they recognize that the collusion fraud they perpetrated against the American people has collapsed. So when the Mueller report says there's no obstruction or there's no collusion, what they're saying is everything the Democrats created through Hillary Clinton and the Democratic National Committee in league with the Obama administration, FBI, CIA, state, you name it, Department of Justice, was a lie. There was no evidence of Russia collusion. So everyone who was suggesting there was either knew or should have known. Who knew or should have known? I've gone through it in the past. I'll go through it again. Barack Obama, Joe Biden, James Comey, Hillary Clinton, the Democratic National Committee, Susan Rice, Peter Strzok, Lisa Page, James Comey, Andrew McCabe, James Clapper, John Brennan, John Kerry. I'm sure there are folks I'm leaving off the list. Robert Mueller, Loretta Lynch, Hillary Clinton, of course. I may be repeating myself. So this is why they're making noise about a subpoena fight. And frankly, right now, the president's still within his rights to stop this report, this smear operation, from being released, to further impair his ability to do his job. Now, every time he fires someone, he's going to be subject to a Justice Department investigation. Is that the way it's supposed to work? Shut it down. So we like the idea of transparency, but I object to the government abusing its powers to target an innocent victim like President Trump. I know the left hates it when I say that President Trump is a victim, but he really is a crime victim here. These people who illegally targeted him out of the Clinton operation and league with the FBI and DOJ have misused government resources to target someone for partisan and political reasons.